Maia is an author of Carbon Queen, the remarkable life of nanoscience pioneer Mildred Dresselhaus, our very own. She's an editor, writer, and producer of science, academic, and children's media. Deputy Editorial Director at MIT News, Maia previously served as the Editorial Director of BrainPop and as a staff member of Discover, Space.com, Aviation Week in Space Technology, and Scholastic's Science World. Maia writes often on the history of women in STEM and on diversity in STEM media. She's also internationally known for her custom Lego projects, including Women in NASA, a Lego idea winning, an Amazon best-selling toy, and Women of Computing, a Lego Ideas finalist. I am holding the Millie Lego piece, which I hope you'll have a chance to see after the talk. It will be available there on the side. Maia has also been an MIT lecturer on the history of women in STEM and led efforts to increase the participation and representation of women on Wikipedia. But today, most importantly to us, thank you for being here and telling us about your latest book on Millie. Welcome.
Thank you, Vladimir. Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for being here. We'll probably mention this a few times today, but tomorrow would have been Millie's 92nd birthday, so it's kind of... Oh, this microphone. Got it. Okay, better. So tomorrow would have been Millie's 92nd birthday, so I think this is like a perfect day to come together and really celebrate her life and her career here at MIT. We're going to give a little bit of a background to her life and her work. And then I'm honored to have two MIT professors here to help me describe her impact both here at MIT and around the world. And then afterwards, I would invite all of you to come and join us in a bit of a celebration. We have cupcakes and food. We have some Millie minifigs available, and I think we're going to be doing a raffle. So after we speak, hopefully you've gotten your little red tickets, and we will be giving out some of those. And we can do book signing later if you are interested in that as well. So I'm going to talk briefly about Millie's just general contributions here. And most of my slides today are actually very non-technical, but I will kind of go a little bit into some of her technical work. I think some of the fun things that we will discuss are things that you might not know about her just based on, research that I did speaking with family members. When I wrote this book, I had so much material to go with that it was overwhelming how many interviews she had done over her many, many, many years and decades in the spotlight in terms of being a leader in the STEM fields. So one of the wonderful things about doing this project was uncovering some of the archives here at MIT and elsewhere, and also really getting a sense of some of her family life, which I certainly hadn't known at all before this. Okay. So, this is Millie Dresselhaus, and this was one of her largest prizes that she ever was awarded. And it's obviously, for many of you, you will know that this is President Barack Obama giving her the Presidential Medal of Freedom, which, as many of you know, is actually one of the highest civilian awards that you can receive in the United States, in addition to Congressional Medals of Honor. And Millie received this in 2014. For her work in electrical engineering at MIT. And that day, I think she was the only scientist in the room that day, and President Obama noted that her influence is all around us in the cars we drive, the energy we generate, the electronic devices that power our lives. And so, I just wanted to also make a brief note that I will talk about Millie using her first name. Sometimes people are a little bit taken aback by this, but as some of you, or many of you maybe would know, Millie was known to everyone as Millie, even though Mildred is, of course, her given name. It was a term of endearment that she had, even going back to when she was a kid, and even close family members would call her Millie as well. So just wanted to let you know that I will continue that tradition. On the right here, we see a number of carbon allotropes or forms, only some of which were really known before her work began in 1960. So some of the forms that she helped discover are, for instance, well, first I'll note A and B are the forms for diamond, which is A, and B, which is graphite, which is the first major system that she looked at when her career began in 1960. Later on, she helped lay foundations that led to the discovery of some of these other forms, including D, which is the Buckminster fullerene or buckyball, and G, which many of you will know as a carbon nanotube. So we'll go a little bit into what these materials do and why they're important a little bit later, but I wanted to kind of take things back all the way to her early childhood as we begin, and we can talk a little bit about where she came from and why her background really helped shape who Millie became, who Millie became in terms of her scientific work, her mentorship, her professorship. So Millie was born November 11th, 1930 in Brooklyn, actually, but she grew up in the Bronx. Her family moved when she was a few years old. Her brother had been a musical prodigy in the violin, and Millie shortly after also showed musical aptitude, and both of them became scholarship students at a music school in Manhattan. So Millie's family was, they were immigrants who came from what is now Poland, although some of the geographical areas have now changed names, but her family was extremely poor. They came to New York City during the Great Depression, and it was a difficult time just because, tensions were high in Europe. Unfortunately, most of Millie's family that was left behind perished in the Holocaust. And this really shaped her life in many ways. Her father had a really difficult time with that and struggled with it. And as a result, her mom really had to pull up her bootstraps and become the main breadwinner of the family, which was relatively unusual at that time. At the left here, you can see Millie in her middle school photo. She's in the center there. Her junior high school and her elementary school experiences were frustrating for her. The neighborhood that she grew up with in the Bronx was what she called dangerous, and she described a number of times gang activity and just the opportunity to actually get mugged, essentially. And she actually described that she came home sometimes a bloody mess from some fighting that was going on, mostly children, but you never knew what was going to happen. So her parents kept a short leash, and at least in the beginning, she and her brother were not really allowed to travel too much around the city. But because of their music lessons, which were in Manhattan, and again, they lived in the Bronx, she ultimately did get the opportunity to really see New York City. And as she got older, she had more independence and more opportunities to explore. And a lot of this was thanks to her music school. She used to go watch movies that were paid for by the school. Again, her family was extremely poor, and she really couldn't afford any of these kind of luxuries. But so one time, for instance, more than one time, she would go around to the Museum of Natural History, for instance, and she loved doing this, and she loved science in general, but she didn't have a lot of money to pay for this. So she found a way to sneak in. And so she would sneak in often and bring her friends kind of for fun. She actually got kicked out at one point, but she went right back. And after a few weeks, she said she went right back to sneaking in. And so basically that was a very early example of, not being able to hold Millie down. If she wanted to do something, she was going to do it. Right here is her high school yearbook. And Millie was able through high school to kind of see other opportunities that she wasn't able to see earlier in her education. She ended up going to Hunter College High School, which is one of the magnet schools in New York City. And at the time, it was the only school of this caliber, I would say, that would actually accept girls. And so her elementary school and her junior high schools were not, they did not provide her an opportunity to really learn what would be on the entrance exams for her high school, but she went to the library and she actually learned pretty much everything by herself and aced the entrance exam and got into this very prestigious high school, which is still working today, which is now co-ed. But as just an example of how worldly she was even at that time, her fellow students put this phrase in her yearbook: any equation she can solve, every problem she can resolve, Mildred equals brains plus fun. In math and science, she's second to none. And Millie really blossomed when she was at Hunter High, and she ultimately ended up going to Hunter College in New York City. And at that point, she met one of her first two major mentors of her life. At the left here is Rosalind Yallow, who some of you will know was a Nobel Prize winning scientist. She was a medical biophysicist, but she had a hard time herself finding a career in science. And once she had an opportunity to finish her PhD, she didn't really know how to create a career for herself. This was a time after the war when opportunities were really closing for women. And she was also Jewish, which is another strike against her. And so when she met with Millie, there was an overlap of basically 16 months in which Millie was a student and Rosalind Yallow was an adjunct professor essentially at Hunter College. And this just happenstance led to a wonderful mentorship that extended for many decades. And so Millie met Professor Yallow at that time in her sophomore year, and she said it was sort of a love at first sight in terms of just knowing that they had a kinship. And Rosalind Yallow really encouraged Millie to continue on and become a scientist. She gave her an example that, this is something that you can actually do, and you might have difficulty, but not to be deterred, and you can continue and do this. And I want you to do this, so you should do this, because Millie didn't really have any sense of the opportunities. At the time, she grew up in a world where girls were not encouraged to become professionals at all. They were encouraged to, Millie said often that the opportunities in terms of professional careers were limited to nursing, secretarial work, or teaching. And when Millie first entered high school, she thought she would become a teacher. But Rosalind Yallow really encouraged her and said, no, I think you have the goods. If you're interested in science and math, which she really was at the time, you should continue on. And so that is what she did. Millie ultimately got a fellowship to Cambridge at the University of Cambridge in their physics department as a Fulbright. And then she came back and did a master's at Harvard, and ultimately went to the University of Chicago, where she met Enrico Fermi, another Nobel Prize winning physicist, who was another major mentor in her life. Fermi, Millie said many times, taught her to think like a physicist, but he also encouraged her, both because she was a woman, and that was extremely unusual at the level that she had already reached just being a PhD student in physics, and also just because she was a younger person, and Fermi, by all accounts, was extremely open to having conversations and events and parties at his house with younger people. And this was something that really impressed upon Millie, the idea that, there didn't have to be this strict hierarchy in terms of like conversation and sharing of ideas. And this is something that she later would take on with her as she began her career. So just briefly, on the left here is Millie shortly after she met Jean Dresselhaus, her longtime husband, who eventually would come and be working here at MIT as well, along with her. They got married in 1958, and they had 4 children in fairly quick succession. And you can see here Millie at Cornell, where Jean had a faculty position that he had established, and Millie had become a postdoc also at Cornell at that time, and so they had their first child there, Marianne. And this was well before the days of daycare on campuses, so Millie would bring in her young daughter, and I'm not even sure what she's doing there, but she's clearly working on some equipment, doing whatever she needs to do, and just making sure that Marianne is taken care of. So just to talk a little bit about the beginning of her career. So Millie did face discrimination in a number of different ways when she was starting out. Her PhD advisor at the University of Chicago was extremely traditional, and he didn't even want to have anything to do with Millie at the time. He basically told her to get lost anytime he saw her, and this was obviously very discouraging to Millie. But fortunately, she had this fortitude to continue on, and she also had certain people in her life that encouraged her. So she was able to finish her PhD despite this. But also, when she was at Cornell, she was also very severely discouraged from continuing on. The person that she had originally started to work with when she got there left Cornell very quickly after she arrived. And so she didn't have any support. And again, you have to imagine, this is a time when it is all but unheard of to have a woman in a scientific realm in research labs. Obviously, we still struggle with representation in the STEM fields, especially in physics and electrical engineering and materials engineering and all that. But at this time, it was, you were kind of like an alien if you were a woman trying to have a career in this area. So anyway, all this to say, Millie and Jean ultimately had a big decision to make because Cornell did not want to give her an opportunity to be a scientist. And ultimately, Jean made this wonderful sacrifice, and he gave up his faculty position so that they could find another job. And so two of the opportunities that they were given were places that they could work together, and they both had research opportunities. One would at IBM Research, which was there was just building a gleaming new center in Yorktown Heights, New York, just outside of New York City. And Millie and Jean thought very strongly about going there, but they also had another offer from MIT Lincoln Lab here in Massachusetts, and ultimately they decided to come to MIT, so that's how she came here. And shortly after, her PhD project was on superconductivity, but when she arrived at MIT at the Lincoln Lab, she was instructed to basically do anything else but other than superconductivity. So she was looking for a research opportunity, a research subject very quickly, and Jean had suggested carbon might be hiding some interesting physics. So she was interested in that, and she went down that road, and that ultimately became a very fruitful career for her. So again, up on the top, we're seeing diamond, which is the A, and B, which is graphite. And graphite was her first real model that she studied. And one of the first things that Millie and Jean looked at was something called graphite intercalation, which is when you intersperse the layers of graphite with other materials to see what would happen. And today, of course, the individual layers of graphite are known as graphene, and they can be isolated, and you can do all sorts of things with them. But at the time, really the only way to separate the layers was to have them intercalated with other materials. And so Millie was using magneto-optics. She was using a number of different methods and materials to look and see, just characterize what kind of electronic structure there was, depending on whatever concoctions she was creating. And really, these were things that were thought to be extremely difficult and uncertain in terms of would there be anything interesting coming out of this? But she did find some really interesting properties. She, for instance, one of her early works at the Lincoln Lab, which was one, she told the story a number of times, was that in the early days of carbon science, the placement of electrons and something called holes, which are another type of charge carrier that are sort of like equal but opposite to electrons, were actually placed in the wrong place in basically everyone's research up until that time. And Millie and her colleagues were realizing very quickly that actually they had everything backwards. And so this was very, unusual, and people fought back and said, no, we already know where the electrons and the holes are in the structure of graphite. But Millie persisted and said, we've done our research, we've checked everything, and we really believe that we have it correct. And ultimately, they were correct. And so anytime you're studying graphite or graphene these days, you're doing so with the knowledge of the electron and hole placement that Millie and Jean and their colleagues deciphered at that time. Eventually, Millie had another problem in terms of her being a woman, which was that at Lincoln Lab, she, at a certain point, her boss initially was extremely supportive of her, but he eventually left to come to MIT, the main campus, to run a national lab it was the National Magnet Lab that he basically conceived of and turned into a national facility. And eventually, Millie was getting hassled for coming in at, I think it was like 8:30 or anything before. She was getting hassled for not coming in straight at 8 o'clock. And this was a problem because, of course, she had many small kids at this time. She had like 3-4 kids. And, Jean at the time, unfortunately, was not getting similarly hassled. And she was wondering whether she had an opportunity to continue because, this was only something that she was getting bothered for. There was one other woman on the MIT Lincoln Lab staff at that time who was similarly having the same issue. So somebody suggested, why don't you become a visiting professor at the MIT campus? So that's what she did. She joined the faculty in 1967 as a visiting professor, and immediately she was offered full professorship with tenure, which is pretty incredible because she didn't have to go through the tenure track at all. So clearly her research, and already when she was at Lincoln, had been working on, working with students. But when she became a full professor here at MIT, she just increased that and obviously made it a little bit more official. I love just showing this other picture because it's just one of those examples of Millie being, a trailblazer. And this was a 1970 Japan-USA seminar on the new material science of carbon. I just love it because she was very international in her work from the very beginning of her career. Obviously one of the very few women, and always loved to work with people from around the country and around the world. I'm going to just go quickly over this, but so basically, again, we talked about at the very beginning that Millie helped to underscore some of the basic foundational physics that ultimately would lead to two Nobel Prize winning discoveries. On the right here is, again, the buckyball, which is basically a hexagon, a pattern of hexagons and it's like a soccer ball shape, essentially, but they're all carbon molecules, 60 of them. And originally, we didn't have any idea what these things were, what their use was. But Millie had been irradiating carbon with laser light. She was one of the first people to do this kind of experimentation. And long story short, she implored some scientists that were working at Exxon at the time to look at larger clusters of carbon molecules to see if there might be something interesting going on there. And they did that. And ultimately, they did find that there was this molecule with 60 carbon atoms that ultimately became known as the buckyball after Buckminster Fuller. And the applications for buckyballs have been relatively few over the years, but the discovery of the buckyball has really led to a lot of other things, namely the discovery of nanotubes. Carbon nanotubes are extremely small pipes, essentially, and they're elongated buckyballs that don't have the caps on the end. Millie became an expert and Jean as well, became an expert in carbon nanotubes. They spent decades studying them, and again, provided some of the foundational discoveries that have led to so many more just avenues of research. And one of the first of which was that they predicted that depending on the formulation of the atoms and the location of the atoms along the actual tube, that the properties would change and be different. And when this first came out, this was seen as controversial, but they were proven right. And that, again, is just a very basic concept that now physicists and engineers who are working in this area needed to know to, produce applications, which are many and varied. Just a handful of applications would include medical sensors detecting DNA and hormones, plastic additives. There are carbon nanotubes in anti-corrosion coatings, laptop batteries, chip memory, sporting equipment, reinforced concrete. And, the bonds are extremely strong. So carbon nanotubes are extremely, extremely strong, but they're also extremely lightweight. And so the research applications have just gone up. But I will say, beyond that, the isolation of graphene, which again is the individual layers of graphite, ushered in an even bigger rush of research than carbon nanotube research. And on the right here, Millie was, sort of got in on the ground floor. She was working on this even well before 1990, but you can just see these are a number of research citations based on those keywords. And when in the early 2000s, graphene was finally isolated, and this led to a gold rush of research. And in some cases, people started redoing the experiments that Millie had started working on back in the early days in the 60s and 70s when she had much worse equipment. I wanted to also talk briefly about her import in terms of her work as someone organizing people and not just research. So Millie was someone who had high recognition for her work very early on, and this led her to have opportunities to lead organizations. She was the president of AAAS. She was the president of the American Physical Society. She, on the left here, is being sworn in as the head of the Department of Energy's Office of Science. You can actually see Professor Ernest Moniz, who at a certain point became the Secretary of Energy in a later administration, looking on. And then actually right here, during her tenure in this particular role, she visited Fermi Labs. She would go around the country visiting labs, seeing how things were doing. And one particular anecdote had her, again, going to Fermi Lab, and someone in a research newsletter that summarized her trip said that it was wonderful talking to Professor Dresselhaus. It felt like doing group therapy, and I'm really excited to come back to work tomorrow. Millie also played an enormous role in trying to diversify science. These are just a handful of her female students and people who she mentored in one way or another. Some of them were out at MIT, but many of them were not. I won't name everybody, but Deborah Chung was her first PhD student in the middle on the left. One of her earliest students, Shirley Ann Jackson, who played a major role here at MIT, but then also had a wonderful career herself in physics, and then later became president of Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute. Jing Kang, who is here at MIT and is still doing wonderful work. And then on the bottom right, this young woman, Nettie McRae, who I actually didn't know about when I wrote the book, but she found me on Twitter, and she was telling me that she was really inspired by Millie, and she was encouraged by Millie to work on this nonprofit that she's working on that encourages young people in the STEM fields in her home country. So, and then Over here on the right, we have this wonderful graph that one of her former postdocs made of all of her research works. So Millie published some 1,700 research papers, which is just incredible, and as well as 8 books. I think she had 5 or 6 patents. But the graph shows just how, I mean, you can't even read all the nodes, but there are like, some 1,000 nodes or whatever it is of all her collaborators around the world. And only a couple of them are MIT, of the biggest ones. So basically, the larger the name, the more papers they had in common. And she was just really inspiring in terms of how many people she constantly worked with over her wonderful career. She also was, of course, lauded for her work. She earned something like 40 honorary degrees. Just her, foundational work in solid-state physics was something that, people loved to just invite her to speak. She was inspirational to a lot of people. And this particular photo shows her receiving the Kavli Prize, which was given 10 years ago this year, actually. And she was the first person to win it solo by herself. And she never won a Nobel Prize herself, but again, she was part of 2 especially Nobel Prize winning papers or bunches of research, and she never really felt that she got shunted from the Nobel Prize. She was just very happy to have her research be furthered with her work. So, but anyway, she was, celebrated, and this was her getting an opportunity to meet the King of Norway. And, importantly, she won $1 million with this, and she donated all the prize money to further young researchers. So that was pretty great. So I'll just have 2 more quick slides. One is just giving you a little bit of background. I only met Millie one time, and this was it. So as Vladimir mentioned, I make these minifigures of in the likeness of actual scientists and engineers. And when I joined the MIT staff, I work in the news office, I knew I wanted to give the one I had already made of Millie to her. And so I emailed her. She emailed me back within like 10 minutes. And that was very strange, but also flattering to know that she had somebody had already printed out a picture of it that was online. And it was already on her bulletin board, unbeknownst to me. So she said, "Come on down, I want to meet you." So I, went to her office and gave her the minifigure, and we spoke about being from New York and, just being interested in supporting women in the STEM fields. So that's my picture of her. And then, when we launched the book earlier in the spring, I knew I wanted to update that. And my colleagues at the MIT Press were wonderful in terms of supporting that vision. And so we did make a whole bunch of the minifigs for people to have and really cherish. So lastly, I wanted to just say that, of course, Millie was really looking forward to the opening of MIT.nano. She unfortunately did not live to see it. But, she absolutely would be pleased to see everything that's happened in the years, especially since, it opened, I believe it was in 2018? Yes, 2018. This particular corridor, if you don't already know, this outside courtyard is named, it's not named in her honor in terms of her name, but it's called the Improbability Walk, just because she used to talk about how improbable it was that she became such a well-known scientist and engineer from her, humble beginnings in New York, growing up in a place where, she wasn't expected to do very much. But she had a lot of help along the way, and she acknowledged that, encouragement from professors and teachers and other mentors who are older really played an important part in her development. And so the idea that, some professor might take a student under their wing and have a chat with them on this corridor is really a wonderful thought. So, next time you go down there, the Improbability Walk has a little plaque that you can see. It's actually like very close to Building 10 over there. And, I appreciate MIT.nano's doing that in Millie's honor. And so, yeah, finally, today, as I said, or tomorrow would have been Millie's 92nd birthday. Her husband, Gene, actually also celebrated a birthday in the same week. His birthday was yesterday. Gene, unfortunately, passed last year. So today, we just remember them and thank them for their contributions. This picture was taken, I don't know exactly what year, but they used to celebrate their birthdays together. And so I hope that, we can all celebrate them and thank them for their many years of work, the many students, postdocs, so many people that they touched throughout their lives here at MIT especially, but of course, really all over the world. It's just an inspiring story, and I really appreciate everybody's coming to hear about it. So that concludes the portion where I'm going to be speaking. And so now I would like to invite two people to come sit with me. And first I'm going to introduce them, and then we will have a little conversation. So first, please, Mingda, if you wouldn't mind. Mingda Li is the class of 47 career development professor and assistant professor of nuclear science and engineering at MIT. And so we will be chatting with him. He was also a former postdoc of Millie's. So thank you so much, Mingda, for being here. And Frances Ross is the Ellen Swallow Richards Professor of Materials Science and Engineering here at MIT. And she is a recent transplant to MIT, but she's been doing some amazing work here with MIT.nano, and I can't wait to talk a little bit about it. Okay, so we're gonna head on over here. Yeah, anyway, this is good. I'll sit in the middle. Okay. And then after we're done, we'll take some questions, or if anybody has reflections. We always love to hear extra Millie stories because we know that she touched so many people. So Frances, I'll start with you. You have built a fantastic career, not in the exact same area of solid-state physics as Millie, but you focus your career on advanced electron microscopy. And we were talking just the other day about how you did share some connections, even though you might not have overlapped a whole lot. You both were at the University of Cambridge at the physics department there. Slightly separated in time a little bit, Frances spent like around 20 years, I think it was, at IBM Research, which was the place that Millie and Gene decided not to go to. But regardless of that, like Millie and Gene still, maintained really good collegial working relationships and friendships with people who did work at IBM Research. So, and you also were one of relatively few women to have come up in material science in the 80s and 90s, which, of course, Millie was a first in a lot of ways, and I'm sure you were a first in a lot of ways in the various departments that you've been working at. So obviously, welcome to MIT. I mean, I know you've been here a few years now, but if you could talk a little bit about if you've had any interactions with Millie at all, or if you ever crossed paths with her. I know that one of your more recent papers was focused on graphene and these Moiré patterns, which are, maybe you can describe a little bit about them.
Sure.
Thank you.
Well, thanks. And thanks for the opportunity. And it's really fun to see the pictures. I read the book as PDF. Now I have a real copy. So great to see. I mean, certainly I didn't have any of the same difficulties that Millie had with people even saying, should women be doing science? I hope we've advanced. We still have a way to go, but in general, I think we've come a long way since those times. So I met Millie several times in visits to MIT, and looking at her work, it touches so many aspects of nanoscience. So every one of us in nanoscience and using the facilities at MIT.nano has some kind of spiritual connection there, I think. My interest is in seeing how nanomaterials grow. So it's one thing to say, yes, we'd like to have this particular structure, but in real life you have to have a way of making it, and you have to not just make one of it either. You need to make many copies of the same thing. It would be nice if they all were exactly the same, or at least close enough that they would share the same physical properties. So then you come to the question of, how do I get the atoms to go where I want them to go? And I had to explain this to some undergrads at one time, and I thought, okay, I know how to do this. We have cats at home. We have pet cats. You know that you can't tell a cat what to do, right? Cat's going to do its own thing. But if you have a can of food, then you know what the cat will do. If you bring the food here, it's going to follow you. So I feel like atoms are sort of the same. They have their own thing that they want to do. And if you can make that thing equivalent to what you would like them to do, then everything is great. So can you direct the assembly of atoms into a particular location with a particular structure, and thereby create a nanomaterial that is growing spontaneously and yet under your control? That's the objective. And because it's nanoscience, you need nanoscale observational tools to see it. So you need a very fancy microscope to resolve where the atoms are and where they're moving and how they get there. And so then you're looking at very expensive equipment. And moreover, the equipment has to be in a very clean environment, like no noise, no vibration from the tea, no sound, no electromagnetic disturbances. And so you end up having to invest in a building that will allow the equipment to perform in the way that it needs to. And that's where we come to these big shared facilities. Obviously, one person shouldn't have that all to themselves, so all the equipment is shared. And this also means that there can be expert technical support, and that really is what makes it work. So the technical support that keeps the equipment going. So I feel like we're all connected in some way through the things you need in order to do nanoscience. Millie was looking at optical and electronic properties of her materials. We're looking at the structural properties, but we shared the same interest in controlling matter at the nanoscale in order to achieve properties that you want in real life. So sorry, that's kind of a long, I've forgotten even what the question was at this point. But
No, that's just a good background and a good
so,
primer. Yeah,
so,
no, absolutely.
Yeah.
Well, Millie was just starting, I mean, she spent a lot of her later career looking at, graphene, the individual layers that you could, separate out and characterize and look at individually. So now we have a new field of what's known as twistronics, which is where you take different layers of graphene and you slightly twist them and see what happens in terms of electronic properties. And some really interesting things are happening in that field, and in fact that will be the subject, I believe, of this year's Dresselhaus lecture, which is going to be on the 21st. So make sure you come to that as well. But one of the pieces that we created out of our office about your research had talked a little bit about the interface between this 2D material, so graphene, and more 3D materials, which is what we're going to ultimately have to work with when we create advanced materials. So that's what this particular piece that you had worked on recently. I'm curious if you can tell us a little bit about that.
Sure, yeah, happy to. So I was talking about getting atoms to assemble into places you want them to go. And one interesting thing about nanoscience is that it's all very well creating a single material at the nanoscale, but what you really want for the ultimate in functionality is to be able to combine different materials. So you'd have a small region where, say, two different materials come together, and if you can control the interface between them, or at least I should say, the more precisely you can control the interface between them, the more control you'll have over the property of the combined nanomaterial. So of course you have, in this case, you have a crystal, which is graphene, it's a sheet of atoms, and then you have a 3D material like gold, which is a three-dimensional arrangement of atoms. The chemical bonding in one case and in the other case, they're quite different. So these are not naturally compatible materials. You can place gold on graphene, it doesn't really want to stay. You can poke it with a needle in a scanning probe microscope. You can push it along the surface. So it's quite entertaining. But one interesting feature is that when you have two structures that are different, when they touch, there's a kind of like a beating between the two structures. It's like what you get when you hear two musical notes that are slightly different frequencies. You hear that beating where the frequencies they reinforce, and then a moment later they cancel out, and you get these different frequencies compared to what the two original ones were. And the same applies in these real examples of materials, that if you place one on another, you get an interference pattern where the atoms in the two lattices, at some places they're directly above each other, in other places one is in the gap between the atoms on the other side. And that determines the electronic, optical properties, all the properties of the nanomaterial. So Millie was one of the founders of the idea that two sheets of graphene, if you twist them, you get this beautiful interference pattern. It changes the properties. Pablo will talk about how this can induce superconductivity, which is sort of amazing that could happen. If you have gold and graphene, you get the same thing. The atoms aren't in the same arrangement on the two sides. In some places they're in sync, in other places they're out of sync. So we can, if we have the powerful characterization tools, we can quantify where are the atoms. Are they exactly where you expect? Have they got slightly distorted? How can we control that? And how is that going to be related to the properties? So I feel like if we think of all the building blocks we have for nanoscience, it's not just each block, it's every junction between any two blocks that gives you another opportunity to control the properties, to design a material to do what you want, whether it's a quantum computer or a neuromorphic device or a sensor of some sort. So many opportunities in there.
That's so wonderful.
So, yeah.
It makes me smile just seeing how excited you are about this, and knowing that, I mean, obviously there are many scientists and engineers who have been working in these fields in the decades since Millie began, but she was here at the beginning, and so it's just nice to know that her work is continuing on in your work and the work of many others. Mingda, I wanted to give you an opportunity to speak as well. Now, you had a personal relationship with Millie that was a little bit closer in terms of, you were a postdoc with her. Can you talk a little bit? Actually, I want to give one quote for a second, and I want to give everybody just a sense. So after Millie died, her family put together this wonderful compilation of interviews, and they transcribed some of the events that happened at a celebration that we had for Millie around this time 5 years ago. And one of the pieces that was on this site, and you can still go to it, it was a PubPub site that they created. Mingda wrote this wonderful remembrance of Millie. And I'm just going to read one paragraph, and then maybe we can talk a little bit about your remembrances of Millie. Mingda wrote, "Many people can tell you about her contributions to science, but I want to talk about something more personal. I'd like to talk about how committed she was as a mentor. She gave me guidance and advice, of course, but that was the least of it. Millie's heart was as open as her office door, and her kind advice was shared freely with anyone who dropped by. Yet the strength of her dedication and inspiration were more powerful than even the strong nuclear force, and it planted something within my soul that changed me forever. This incredible force focused my mind and made my soul soar with scientific inspiration," which is so lovely. So I wonder if you could tell us, in this article, Mingda goes on with a number of examples of times when Millie was, just very supportive. And I have a few examples here, but if you wanted to pick some of your favorites, let us know. I mean, from correcting papers to taking notes at conferences to, as we talked before, coming in at 7:30 to connect with you. Tell us.
Sure, yeah. The first time when I reached out to Millie is to try to look for a postdoc position. And it's a morning, and she said I was just flying into her office like a little bird. And I was, what, little bird? And then in the next like a year and 2 years, I actually meet Millie always like 7:30 in the morning. Then it seems like who will just speak or chirping as early as like 7 o'clock? Then I am actually a little bird, just talking, and in the morning it's very quiet and very calm, and it's really joyful time at that moment. I cherish that a lot.
That's wonderful. You talked also about how, for instance, there was one case where you had a paper that you had worked on and kind of, was really struggling with because it kept getting rejected. And yet Millie helped you along, not in a way in which she could have used her stature to kind of just get the paper accepted. But tell us a little more about how she handled that with you.
Right. One step back, I want everyone to think about the harmony for Millie on two things. One is the strength, to put the time for all the struggles she has experienced. And she still kept another thing is the warmth. So she still keeps this optimism and to help people. I think that's the attitude, the strength to keep it going, including that paper, and also the warmth that she encouraged me to do the right thing. The journal I was specifically talking is this PNAS. So as this National Academy of Science member, they can just submit there for free. But apparently we are having some miscommunication with reviewers. 5 years, right this year. So the topic of that paper gets accepted by funding agency. So they even have a Mildred this topic right on that exact topic. So, and she just wouldn't just use her role to put into this PNAS directly or something. And even, I think she's partly with me that not all the reviewers are fully understand or something. She still asked me to do the right thing, fail 6 times, we still revise 6 times, and then let's submit for the 7th times. Always calm, and always keep it going. So that's the strength and warmth I feel at the same time.
That's wonderful. Yeah. Yeah, you also mentioned that she used to come into conferences, and I mean, she went to many conferences. Her granddaughter, Shoshi, created this ginormous timeline that literally, it spanned, I think after the celebration that we had of her life, it spanned a number of different walls. And I have a PDF of it, and I referred to it when I was writing the book. And so she gave she went to so many conferences, and Mingda has said that at so many of them, she would always take copious notes. And what would she do at the end? You said she would come up and...
She would come up and always ask questions. Because I would think, especially as a junior PhD students, as a beginner of the researcher, not everyone dare to ask. Maybe they will think it's a dumb question or something. I think I'll say this courage to ask questions and really change everything. The secret here is she always asks a really very, very deep and very fundamental, this big question, not always. She told me it's actually sometimes just a basic question, but she has to keep asking. And I think that will change this atmosphere and encouraging everyone else to also ask questions. If we don't understand, we never pretend we do. Even the most knowledgeable people, they are still on the way to pursue knowledge. So even Millie can ask a question, then why not any grad students? Why not everyone? So everyone should come ask something.
Right.
So that's very, very helpful for her.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much for those reflections. I really appreciate it. I think we want to give a little bit of time for if anybody has a question, or if you have any Millie experiences or reflections that you would like to give. I know sometimes we get really wonderful Millie stories that I've never heard. I think pretty much every event that I had, somebody has come up with some really interesting story that I haven't heard. Yeah.
Just one short sentence. I mean, even right now, my phone cover is always Millie. So many years, like a Millie.
Oh, yeah? Oh, that's awesome.
I want to say it again.
So I mean, I actually also worked with Millie before she passed away. And I write a lot of poetry for her, even after her passed away. And then I remember Millie's daughter, Mariana, she usually comes to our lab, our office. Millie also corrected. I also ask help with the help of a female student. We craft a beautiful picture, image for her, and then with my poetry. The first time I met her at Houston in around 2010. So, and then it's very, I mean, Millie is really, really, really supportive, and always, right now, my cell phone, the cover, it's always Millie after so many years. So, and also like any events like related to Millie, I will try to attend. And it's very, very encouraging. So even like, for example, I'm still looking for faculty position and stuff like that after so many years. I mean, still Millie kept me very warm. So after many years, after Millie passed away, I still write a lot of poetries about her.
Oh, that's wonderful.
Thank
Well,
you
I
very
would love
much.
to see your poetry. I'll have to get your info after.
Okay, thank you.
We actually had another person who was a poet who contributed a poem about Millie that's in the beginning of my book. And I think Millie really did that. She inspired people to be very creative. There are people who've named their children after Millie. There are people who've named their pets after Millie. Yeah, I should probably do a blog post at some point about like the pets, like the Instagram accounts that I've seen where people have said that they've named their, whatever pets after Millie. I think one of them actually is here as a professor at MIT. I still haven't met her yet in person. She has bunnies that are named at, one of them's named at Millie. So thank you for your reflections. I really appreciate that. Yeah.
Oh, yeah, so I work with the university, I work with the Institute as a patent attorney. And I'd worked for a long time with Professor Jing Kong, who you showed earlier. And
Yeah.
so it wasn't until later that I worked on a couple cases with her and Professor Dresselhaus. And although I mostly worked directly with Professor Kong and her students, I'd always include Professor Dresselhaus on the correspondence. And the other day I went back and looked back at some of that correspondence because it had made an impression on me. Although I didn't know her well and she didn't know me well, but whenever I would report something, she would respond by saying, please let me know how I can be of help, or, thank you for looking after our interests. And it was things that I wouldn't, she had already been inducted into the National Inventors Hall of Fame and received, so much recognition that I wouldn't expect her to respond to these messages, but she did, which, really told me something about just how, kind and unassuming she was. And, the professors here are generally, very kind and very helpful, but, she took it to such a degree that it made an impression on me.
Absolutely. Yeah, I've heard that story, that sentiment many, many times. So absolutely. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Francis, you beautifully described sort of in nanotech, you follow the beat of nature. Can you say within the measurement instrumentations today, what is lacking? What could get better in following the beat of nature?
That's a good question, which is what we say when we need a bit of time to think about the answer. I think that there are philosophical deficiencies and practical ones. So the practical issue with all of this is that it takes a lot of time and it takes a lot of money. And as an experimentalist, you're doing one thing at a time. And so maybe given all the massive combinations of materials, if there were some way to do parallel experiments and look at which one gives the best outcome, you could really get to a solution much more quickly. So this is happening. It's under development. The biologists are very good at sort of massive data and picking out the ground truth from a lot of noisy data, let's say. In material science, we don't tend to do that in the same way. And I think in practical terms, the equipment performance is so good that probably the next frontier is just making it work more efficiently in terms of the human, input into it. I feel like in terms of what do we lack in sense of characterization, I think a lot of the lack is really a kind of correlation. So if I do a microscopy experiment and somebody else is doing an optics experiment, what you need is to say, what is it about this structure that gives this property? And so that link between different nano kind of techniques it's a hard thing to do because we tend to be specialized. But I think that when it works, is extremely powerful. So microscopy has had a fabulous few decades of development. We're at a very good place with seeing individual atoms. Even within a material, you can see a single atom moving around under the right circumstances. This is a very powerful capability, and if we just combine it with these other things, you know, that's a multiplier of the probing the beat of nature. I like that. Great. Good. Thanks. Yeah.
Anyone else?
Cool.
Thank you, Charisse. I lived down the corridor from Millie for 17 years, and her and Jean were amazing friends to have on the far side of the building. Jean would often come by to eat cookies from me. That was a good way to engage Jean very easily and tell stories of amazing things him and Millie would have done. But Millie was always the steadfast force, right, where Jean would be the driver, driving her to the airport. That was his job, he felt, to ensure that the students are taken care of as she's getting yet another honorary degree. And when she came back, it was just remarkable to see the amount of ink of every paper that they touched. There's my own paper as a grad student, and my advisor at some point, I said to him, I think the paper weighs more from all the ink you put on it. And I think every single one of Millie's papers that her students gave her probably doubled in weight after all the great comments she gave them. She was very, very, very thorough. The story of the improbability walk also struck me, because thank you for repeating it. The part that I heard from, and this is from how the name of the improbability walk came about, was in discussion with the family, where Millie did find her journey improbable. And she found her walks with Enrico Fermi at University of Chicago, because they both lived in the same neighborhood, those morning walks accidentally when they were both walking back to campus as being the way she learned how to be a scientist. It's those exchanges. And the result of which is that whenever she was traveling onto the other side of the campus, she would grab a student that was heading the same way to give them a chance to ask her questions and to give her a chance to be inspired, just like the Fermi was inspired by those youthful enthusiasm of ideas. She would not miss a beat doing that. And it was very, very joyful. I had a number of chances of partaking in those walks. And there was always a question about, what do I care about? What is it that I can tell her? And how can she contribute to that? It was remarkable, absolutely remarkable. And I do very much find myself tremendously fortunate to have a chance to have known them. They have spent many hours looking from the windows of Building 13 towards the construction site of MIT.nano.
I'm sure, yeah.
At one point, I approached Millie and I said, Millie, it'd be amazing if you can help me fundraise for this building. And she said, what do you mean? I'm like, you don't need to do anything. Just let me use your name. Like, let me say that you are a part of this. She's like, well, of course you can do that, but why me? I'm like, how humble do you have to be not to recognize that, you can give me a transformational opportunity to engage people outside of whom I can usually engage. And she said, of course, any way I can. They're both incredible people, both her and Jean. And I do find myself very, very much different due to the fact that I spent my early days at MIT in their vicinity, just observing.
That's wonderful. Thank you for sharing that. Yeah, I think the only thing that I regret with having written this is that I didn't get to know her better in life. I mean, I saw her across campus a few times, but really the only one time that I got to talk with her was that one time in her office. And I met Jean once, but it was far enough along in his life that he wasn't able to share as many of the memories as I was, wondering about. But, just the chance to connect with the family. They have 5 grandchildren now, and I've met most of them. And, one of her granddaughters, actually several of her grandchildren are now in the STEM fields themselves, which is really wonderful too. So, yeah. Well, thank you, everybody. I think we are We are set with our presentation, and I'm happy to meet you after if you'd like. Please, let's go have some celebratory cupcakes. Thank you again to everybody